Welcome to Crossroad Connection. My name is Art Van Walde and I'm your host, and today I have the privilege of introducing to you Lisa Blystra, the new president of Crossroad Bible Institute. And Lisa, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
And I know for many people this is probably the first time they're putting a face to the name. And I thought it would be a good idea for us to begin by having you tell us a bit about yourself. Who is Lisa Blystra?
Sure, happy to do so. I grew up in West Michigan. I actually live close to Saugatuck now, in the Holland area, and attended high school in Holland. Went on to nursing school, actually in Kalamazoo at Western Michigan University in Bronson. And spent a number of years in the healthcare industry before being called into ministry in the late 90s. I have 3 children. The third will be getting married the end of this year. And I am blessed with 5 beautiful grandchildren. And so I'm in a changing season of life. Recently, my parents moved in and live with us now. And so I've got grandkids on one end and grandpa and grandma on the other end. So my life is full of family, lots of opportunities there, but I also love ministry, and so I'm very grateful to be taking on this new challenge here at Crossroad.
So Lisa, you are a wife, you are a mom, you are a grandma, and you are now the president of Crossroad Bible Institute. I look at that and I say, that is a full plate. How are you going to balance all of that?
I don't know, we'll see.
Okay.
I actually have worked most of my life. When my children were smaller and I was working as a nurse, I worked part-time. But over the last 15 years, I've been involved in full-time work in ministry. And I just really find that serving other people really keeps my tank full. Lot of support at home. I have a wonderful husband. My mother and father are very supportive of my work. And so somewhere along the line, everybody pitches in and we make it happen.
Several years ago, God sort of pushed you in your life. He sort of nudged you. It's when you were a nurse.
Yes.
And you've talked to me about that story, about how He started to open your eyes to looking at the community at large. And that was sort of the beginning of God sort of moving you towards prison ministry. Can you talk to us about that?
Sure. My parents were very focused on serving others when I was growing up. In fact, even my grandparents, I can remember as a young girl, my grandma was always the person that invited anybody in the neighborhood that didn't have a place to go, was at our Thanksgiving and Christmas table. So I remember very young learning that life was really about others. My mom and dad did foster care. I grew up with a foster brother, and they were very giving people. And I really think that shaped me profoundly as I became an adult. Working in the hospital, I worked in the emergency room, and I was known kind of to be the person that was drawn to marginalized folks that would come in. And I think God gave me the gift of mercy and just a heart for struggling people. In the late 90s, I had been involved in a number of community-based development projects that the hospital got involved in. A sexual assault nurse examiner program, some pediatric injury prevention projects, and I just liked building things and really got a new sort of vision for all the great things that the community was doing to serve the same people that were coming in to the hospital environment. And I really began to see that there was a whole nother world besides hospital care out there. Got drawn to starting a pediatric injury prevention project and had the opportunity to build a collaborative of a lot of different agencies in the community that were focused on helping kids be safe. There's a lot of different ways that you can look at a problem And everybody, if they give their part of fixing something, we can build something better than what one individual organization can do on their own. At the same time, I was involved in leadership at our church.
And that's Ridgepoint Church,
That's
correct?
Ridgepoint Church in Holland, yes. And I was involved in the search process for hiring a new pastor at Ridgepoint. We ended up hiring a man whose name is Jim Liskey, who also had a very huge heart for lost people. And he ended up coming to Ridgepoint, and shortly thereafter, he asked me to join the staff at Ridgepoint. I didn't really know why I was being called there, but I was confident that that was God's next assignment for me. So in 2003, I joined the staff of Ridgepoint and was initially commissioned to develop our pastoral care ministries, which then eventually led to a number of intentional community partnerships that we developed at the church. And then my responsibility was all of our local and global missions, and really getting our people engaged in service through our local and global partners.
And wasn't one of the things that you were involved in dealing with prison ministry?
Yes. So again, there were some things going on at the same time in my life that obviously were God ordained as I look back now. But I had an acquaintance, a friend of mine from the emergency department, whose husband got in trouble with the law, and he ended up incarcerated. And they were not connected necessarily spiritually to a church. I guess I would probably say that they were nominal believers at that time. And he was leaving behind his wife and 2 small children who really didn't have a place to be cared for or a place to belong. His wife became involved in our small group, and quite honestly, their family became part of our family, and we would journey with them over the next many years through that process. Doing so really opened my eyes to a huge injustice that I didn't even know existed. He was housed up in the Upper Peninsula, and so once a month she would make the trip up there with their children. A number of times myself or our family would accompany them there to either sit with kids so she could visit or visit him. And I think just getting on the inside of a prison for the first time, again, God really created a stirring in my heart that this system is not fixing anything.
In many ways bent on keeping them down.
Right, yes. I think we saw him needing, for example, to have particular therapies that were required because of his crime, and the therapies weren't offered where he was. So he would come up for parole review, and he would get denied just because he hadn't taken a class that wasn't available there. I mean, just examples of how the system really was not supporting his rehabilitation. The exciting part was while that was going on, she was getting loved on and enfolded in the faith community back at home. And he, God was really watching for him, and he was being enfolded in a community of faith on the inside. And I recently learned he was a Crossroad student. And the other thing that was amazing is we had a group of people at the church that were really focused on regular contact with him. He would take the letters that he got and circulate them through his cell block. And there were a number of prisoners that had no contact with the outside world, that had no visitors coming in to see them. And so these letters really served as kind of a point of ministry penetration to the rest of his cell block. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about since coming to Crossroads is how awesome it is that people are getting written notes from us. Because I think you can go in and have a one-on-one conversation with somebody, or even a small group sort of conversation with a group of men or women, but the ongoing push out of that is somewhat limited if you didn't happen to be in on the conversation, where letters can be read over and over and over again.
Also, many times they will send them to their family members.
Right.
So they can read them.
Right. I'm reading letters coming back saying the same thing, like somebody in my cell block gave me this letter or gave me a lesson, and that's how I became introduced to CBI, and for some of them eventually introduced to the Lord. So he had that experience going on, and she was growing in her faith on the outside as she was getting more enfolded in the faith community, became very involved in our small group, and it just had layers of profound impact that I can hardly describe. Not only did it change them, did it keep their family together, did it change our family? You know, there were times where my children would say, oh my goodness, you know, they're going to be here again. And I would wonder, is this too much? And yet today I look back and all three of my children are in helping sort of professions. And so I think back on my family of origin, and I can say that impacted me, and I can also say now that it impacted my children to see that modeled in our own home.
And not only that, it impacted your church.
It impacted our church greatly. Ridgepoint had started as a church that certainly had a heart for the lost. A addiction recovery ministry was seeded quite soon after Ridgepoint started. It gave, again, a central focus and kind of a picture of what it meant to serve a family that was really struggling. And it was done in a way that was so respectful that I don't really think they ever felt like they were a project. I think they felt like they were part of our family.
Your life has been a life of, from the time you were a little child with grandparents and parents, helping people.
Right.
And this came into your marriage, into your
Right.
family,
Right.
in your church.
Right.
And this has been part of who you are.
Right. It's really my story. I
Right.
think it's what God created me and who He created me to be. And as I look at the zigzags of my professional life, there hasn't been a zig or a zag that wasn't without purpose for the next step.
Well, Lisa, we need to go to break, but when we come back from break, we're going to talk about what drew you to Crossroad Bible Institute. See you in a few minutes.
Are you in prison? Do you know someone who is? Through CBI Bible studies and encouragement from CBI instructors, more than 40,000 people behind bars are learning the truth about salvation through Christ and are developing deeper relationships with God. For an enrollment form, please visit us online at cbi.fm.
Welcome back to this episode of Crossroad Connection. And we are talking with Lisa Blystra, the new president of Crossroad Bible Institute. And we've enjoyed hearing about her story, how God has worked in her life through the zigs and the zags to bring her to this ministry. And Lisa, that's the question I want to ask you. I want to ask you about what drew you to even consider becoming the president of Crossroad Bible Institute?
So over the 10 years that I was on staff at Ridgepoint Church, my friend that I had referenced in the first part of the segment today came home. And what I saw in him was the fact that he and his family would be facing a second sentence. That once he was released, he would not be necessarily graciously assimilated back into the community. Ridgepoint made a decision through a series of events to get involved in certainly helping him reenter, which eventually led to an expansion of the addiction recovery ministry that was already part of the church called 70x7 Life Recovery, to really expand its focus to include support for men and women coming home from prison. And I had the opportunity to build that part of the project. We eventually hired this man to be part of their staff.
Okay.
And through that process, we saw that there were a lot of people in Ottawa County that were looking for support to come home and stay home and reassimilate back into the community and reconnect with family and meaningful relationships. And it was clear that the church needed to be in the center of that. And so Ridgepoint became a leader in the Ottawa County area for the faith-based piece of that, that now is extended into partnerships with a number of churches that are supporting 70x7's efforts on the reentry side. And eventually then our pastor became connected to Prison Fellowship. Prison Fellowship had noted that we were gaining some success in getting the church involved in the whole reentry process. And Chuck Colson and Jim Liskey became connected, and Jim was eventually hired to replace Chuck at Prison Fellowship. He asked if I would consider joining him on staff at Prison Fellowship, leading the church mobilization and national reentry efforts. So I agreed to do that, and for a few years was involved in leadership across the nation, really focusing on getting the church mobilized around this whole issue. In the early part of the summer of this year, my project there ended, and I became aware of an opening at Crossroads, started having conversations with the board here, and thought, wow, you know, could it be that God is going to allow me another leadership position with an organization that is doing something that I'm passionate about, which is the transformation of an inmate, the restoration of a family, and really reclaiming somebody's life that has been involved in the criminal justice system.
This is amazing to me. I'm sitting here thinking, Lisa, about your life. An emergency room nurse, okay? And I've been in emergency rooms as a pastor. And you know, emergency rooms are messy. And you are trying to put together, you know, broken lives, physically broken lives. God took you from that, and has you in an emergency room now, so to speak, of helping people who are spiritually broken, who have spiritually broken lives, families that are broken, and using you to help put together those spiritual lives, those families. And through all those experiences, God has led you here to CBI.
You know, I think even back then, I realized that people are much more than their physical makeup. You know, especially in an emergency room setting, a lot of what people present with are physical sort of symptoms. But so often behind that, there is a complex social story that sometimes does and sometimes doesn't come out, that oftentimes will precipitate a physical illness. So I think when I first stepped away from that and began working in the church setting, I would have friends say to me, so you've kind of given up your nursing career? And you know, I would say not really. I just am in an environment now where I can focus on the social and the spiritual, and instead of really the entry point being physical, it's something else. But clearly, God created us to be beings that are much more holistic than who we are physically. And I think now on this side, yes, I'm looking at people that are involved in chaos because they've made a mistake due to a moral failure that has caused a lot of chaos surrounding that.
In their personal life, their extended life.
Right,
I mean, yeah.
Right. And a lot of times, if you really look at the crime that's not really their point of failure. A lot of times there is a long-standing history, a story that is not like my story was, of people that have grown up in environments that were not positive, that have been connected to not pro-social relationships. But by the grace of God, that's not my story.
I've always discovered you start to get these, I call them percolations in the heart that God is starting to do, starting to move, starting to give ideas.
Yes.
Are you starting to have any of those with CBI, how God maybe is moving in your heart for the future of the ministry?
You know, some. I think that, again, my healthcare background has helped me develop assessment skills. And so I think the last 4 to 6 weeks, I've been really digging into and assessing what is here today. I really believe that the past doesn't have to dictate our future, but it certainly should inform our future. And so I think at this point, I'm really trying to understand what is and how we got to where we are today. What I will say is I'm just very not only encouraged and inspired, but I'm very, very excited about the overall state of the ministry. We have a solid core group of volunteers that come in and administrate the details of the ministry daily. I'm meeting people that have been coming in every week for 29 years and have no plans of stopping anytime soon.
Isn't that amazing?
It is amazing. And instructors that have been on the journey for as many years that are out in the field corresponding with the inmates weekly, and about 30,000 students stateside that are hearing from us regularly, being encouraged by us regularly, that are in the studying process through the lessons that have been created, as well as the international affiliates. And so I just stand back and say, wow, this ministry has a great reach today. When we start talking about how we got here, it feels like most of the growth has just kind of happened organically, that the Holy Spirit has continued to fan this flame of growth across the nation and the world that we really haven't done a lot of planning or strategizing over. So I think the challenge is, how much do we try to change that, and how much do we follow where the Holy Spirit is just leading? And so I think that's one of the things that we're evaluating right now. I think one of the things that, another thing that has been clear is that many of the students that enter into the Crossroad program are coming in at a basic level of either no understanding of the Bible or minimal understanding of the Bible. And the Tier 1 coursework is pretty tried and true. It hasn't changed much over the last 30 years. The Tier 2 coursework is a little less defined. There was some life skill courses that were written that we are trying to introduce now to the next level of students. And we're finding that coursework needs some work in order for it to really be all that it was meant to be for the audience that we're serving. And then in that same light, I really am committed to making sure that we never run out of material for students. So if we have students that are engaging us that are never going to go home, that are serving life sentences, we want them to be lifelong learners of the Word. And so it really causes me to think we have to be strategic about constantly adding new curriculum to our menu of options for the students. Another thing is there has been introduction of our material to families. We have some great materials written for children, and we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of being purposeful about making sure that families and care providers and children have the same opportunity to be learning at the same depth that our inmates learn. Because if somebody comes home to a family that hasn't changed and they've had a transformational experience, the ability to assimilate back in the home becomes complicated. We know that families, intact family is a great motivator for successful return home. If that intact family is centered around Jesus Christ, we know that success is that much more predictable.
What can instructors and donors, what can they expect in the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, I think a lot of what we're going to be doing here in the next few months probably won't be sensed so much on the outside. We have some foundational things that need to be deepened and strengthened. We're going to be doing some work in the office to get our information technology upgraded a bit. And as I mentioned, we want to make sure that our lessons are being upgraded and fine-tuned. We're looking at translating some of our lessons into other languages.
Good.
Some of that won't necessarily be felt out in the field, but what we do want to make sure that we're doing at the same time is really focusing on the solid sort of message that has been Crossroads for the last 30 years. If I can see any area where I think we need to pay attention, many of the volunteers that are engaging us currently are the older generation. And I can see why this is a very attractive ministry for people in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s, because it can be done from your own home. But in order for us to look at sustainability, we have to be able to have confidence that 30 years from now, the people that are 30 today, when they're approaching 60, are involved in ministries such as Crossroads, so that we can continue to reach inmates in prison 30 years from now.
So we need to be going after the 20 and the 30-year-olds,
So we need to-
showing them, how wonderful the ministry this is.
Absolutely. And I think that we know that there is nothing that challenges the next generation like story. And one of the things that is beautiful here is many of our inmates are writing to us regularly and sharing their stories of how their lives are being changed, certainly through the materials that they're learning, but much more through the correspondence and the encouragement letters that they're getting from volunteers. So we know that filling somebody's head with knowledge of Scripture is wonderful, but when that knowledge can be applied and can transfer to the heart, then we see life change. And that happens through a shared experience with another believer, which is what our volunteers are commissioned to do.
Well, Lisa, our time has evaporated from us, and what I'm realizing is in a few weeks, I think we're going to have part 2.
That's great.
Okay.
I love that.
So welcome to Crossroad Bible Institute. Grateful that God has brought you here. Grateful that you are leading us. And we look forward to how God is going to use you to lead this ministry forward.
Wonderful. And I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be surrounded by a great team, wonderful staff here, a number of employees that have been here 15, 16 years. And they have been very gracious about helping me learn the ropes over the last few weeks, and I'm thankful for them as well.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode of Crossroad Connection. It's been a joy to get to know Lisa Blystra. Until next time, we pray God's blessings in your life.